Governor Noem, in your testimony, you talked about how this rule has no scientific basis. You talked about how the administration's classifying it as a minor rule, and we held up the 88-page minor rule that they're proposing. And I know a few years ago I was out in Wyoming and South Dakota, and in the Black Hills area, and I was there on a very sad day. It was a day that one of the mills in South Dakota closed, one of the few mills remaining out there, and wasn't planning to meet with you, Governor Noem, but there was a forest fire that very day, and you had to fly over to be there for the forest fire. And I will say that some things do change. Probably since you've been on the committee, we actually passed out 2 bipartisan pieces of forestry legislation this week, one of them with a 39-0 vote, and it was on Good Neighbor Authority, which I know you worked on when you were here in Congress. And that bill had passed the Ag Committee 51-0. So we're starting to wake up and realize the benefits of forest management. This will allow tribes to do some of the same work, tribes and counties to do the same work that that states are able to do. But when I was there, I reviewed a report, and I've got a forestry background that was written not just by bureaucrats, but retired bureaucrats from the Forest Service on how the forest should be managed. And it was offensive to me from a scientific standpoint and the basis. There was no science or knowledge that went into it. It was purely a biased report written to influence how the forest was going to be managed. So it didn't appear to be a great day in the Black Hills with a mill closing down, a forest fire raging, and a new withdrawal from, if you will, from the Forest Service on land. But you mentioned that Good Neighbor Authority is working and things are happening better in the Black Hills. So I know both of you utilize the Good Neighbor Authority. Can you talk about how that and other programs that are run by the state can actually make conservation better and make our federal lands better?
Well, in the Black Hills, we've utilized Good Neighbor Authority to cooperate with other layers of government, with the state, with counties, with outside associations, and we've run incredible projects that have allowed us to go out and manage the forest to make sure that we were considering all aspects of what a successful forest looks like. That's the kind of rules and suggestions and regulations that I believe we should be focusing on in Congress to cut strings rather than to tie more onto us, to allow us the freedom to look at what specifically is happening in each situation and adapt to that. That was used very successfully for us to defeat and push back the pine beetle epidemic that we were dealing with at that time that was making the Black Hills so dangerous, and it worked overwhelmingly. Since then, we've seen more and more regulation coming in, specifically the GTR that was put forward by the Forest Service that cut our cubic cord feet was pretty devastating for us to see that it wasn't built on anything on the ground. And that's what is another aspect that's impacting the Black Hills right now, why we're seeing our mills being threatened and our timber industry struggling. I know Governor Gordon's been deeply involved in this as well as we've been trying to brainstorm and how we can keep the economy going. It's so interesting to me that we import a lot of our lumber from Canada while we have excess lumber here that we just don't allow ourselves to utilize to help support our country. And now we have lumber from California from burned out wildfires that's being shipped all the way to South Dakota to our 2 mills.
I almost
Doesn't make
passed
any
out
sense.
when I heard the solution was to ship in lumber from
Well,
logs.
they're actually doing it a little
Logs from
bit.
California, add all that freight. Think of the carbon emissions on that.
Absolutely.
To get out your Governor Gordon.
And Mr. Chairman, I mean, it's the lessons well learned in that particular instance. That's because the mill industry in the Northwest is dead. We put it out of business, and so in order to take care of those logs, we had to figure out a way at enormous cost, both carbon and to the taxpayer, to get those logs to South Dakota, just to get them taken care of. Good Neighbor Authority has worked. It's incredibly valuable. We're working on it, obviously in the Black Hills, but also in the western part of our state. And I will point out one other thing that's really critical about this is we look at the Colorado River and the challenges it's had over the last several years. If we don't manage our watersheds well, we will compound our problems with droughts. We will compound our water shortage issues. So, and Mr. Chairman, as a forester, you know very well that when somebody says we're going to take this offline, we're not going to manage the forest, succession doesn't stop. You end up with, post-successional forests that are tinderboxes. You end up with all kinds of strange things that happen. Management happens when we actually have the ability to do something.
And the point I would like to make as we wrap up this panel is that when we choose not to manage, we make a management decision. And if the federal government, the bureaucracy in the federal government is truly concerned about conservation, then let the people who know how to do conservation actually do conservation. Because the federal government's track record on conservation is really pretty poor. And if you look at it compared to tribal governments, to state governments, and to private, you're looking at two different areas and actually two different universes. So thank you to the witnesses for being here today. And Governor Gordon, you mentioned something that a great point. When these trees burn, they're releasing carbon dioxide. When they fall down and deteriorate over time, it's actually methane. They release CH4 from the digestion from the bugs that are eating them. So it's you can burn it up as CO2 or let it rot and create CH4, or you can utilize those products and create good jobs in rural economies. But again, thank you both for being here today. And that's the last questions we have for panel 2. Some members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses that we will ask to respond in writing. And we will now move on to our third panel. And while the clerk resets the witness table, I'll remind the witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. I'd also like to remind our witnesses of the timing lights, which will turn red at the end of your 5-minute statement, and to please remember to turn on your microphone. And as with the second panel, I will allow witnesses to testify before member questioning.